Yeah, and that was kind of different. That was kind of different because she was talking, about things that she was just, the sun was rising as the sun was setting, on my end.
Oh wow. Did you feel like you're from two different worlds when you see stuff like that?
Absolutely. And then it's kind of funny because when you hear, I've been interviewed by people from Nigeria, I've been interviewed from people from Australia, somebody that is from Australia but living in Iran. Um, all places. It's amazing how everybody, loves the idea of podcasts to be able to hear other people's stories, and it's all across the world.
Yeah, it's interesting how you can, if you stick a microphone in someone's face, they'll tell you all kinds of stories because we all have all kinds of stories, right?
Absolutely. I worked for a company for the last 17 years. I worked for the United States Census Bureau, and now I work for a data company. And both those past 17 years, I've actually been in hundreds of people's homes listening to their stories. And if you just give them a moment, they'll tell you everything, and you'll learn all these, some things you didn't want to hear, but then they afterwards are like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I told you all that. You really made me feel safe. So if you are a storyteller and if you are a listener, people do want to tell their stories, and we just have to be brave enough to be able to tell ours so that they will have the courage enough to tell theirs.
Yes, there's this picture that I have on my background when I'm doing certain meetings, and it's a cloud, right? And it's a beautiful blue background sky, and you have this cloud, and then on the left-hand side is the cloud reaching out as a hand, right? And on the right, it's a hand reaching back, and right in the center, they connect. And it's like that to me when you have someone who you meet in your life, and you've created a safe space for them, and they're reaching out to tell your story. If you can make it comfortable enough and safe enough, they will tell you things that they'll think back and be like, oh my God, I was actually comfortable enough to share that with you.
Absolutely. And, that's why I wrote my first book, The Journey of Josephine. And it took me 25 years, 30 years to finally write the book. And part of the reason why I wrote my story is to be a first aid kit for somebody behind me. Because, our stories are not meant for us. As an author, I'm not going to keep reading my story. I read it once, closed the book, and said, wow, I'm not that person anymore. But now my book and my story will give other people the courage to be able to tell theirs. And I've realized, even in writing my story, that even culturally, it's so different from culture to culture and demographics to demographics of who's allowed to tell their stories and who holds their secret tighter because their culture doesn't allow you to tell their stories. So that's what I've learned through telling my story through my book, The Journey of Josephine, that everybody wants to be brave enough to tell their story, but even within cultures, you're not allowed to. And so for somebody to come in and tell their story, now they feel safe to be able to tell theirs. And the more stories that we tell each other and the more times that we're vulnerable, the more that we're locking our hands together and we're becoming a community and we're becoming a tribe. We all need our community and we all need a tribe. And sometimes they're just waiting for somebody to be brave enough to tell their story so that they can open up their mouths to be able to tell theirs.
Yes, and then you have the subculture within certain cultures that some people don't speak about. Let's say some of the traumas they went through, such as, since this is Domestic Violence Month, such as abuse, such as being um, violated in some way, taken advantage of by somebody, by your partner, by your husband, by your wife, your boyfriend, your girlfriend. And it's interesting to sometimes hear when that person fully comes out and expresses it, that they're like, I always wanted to do that. And that ties us into a little bit of your journey. I know that for you, you've experienced some violence in your history and in your past. Speak to us. How did that start, and what was some of the impact it had on you earlier on?
I'm really glad that, we're doing this interview during October, which is, just like you said, is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And it's really a way for women and men and children to be able to be aware that they're not alone. We wouldn't have a Domestic Violence Awareness Month if it wasn't something that continues to happen, over and over again. And we need knowledge, and we need people to be brave enough to tell their story. It's no different than in September having Suicide Awareness Month, because it happens. And so we have these months to be able to have people begin to speak about their journey. And, so this month I am a blogger too. So I'm writing my story on my, for my blog too. And I was thinking, how far back, can I remember that domestic violence was part of my life? And, my dad was a brutal alcoholic. My dad had come from a home they were alcoholics, and my dad wasn't one of those funny ones. He wasn't somebody that you're like, oh, dad's drunk, so now we're going to get some treats and we're going to, he's going to laugh a lot. My dad was a very mean alcoholic. And I remember far back as I was 4 years old and we lived in a farmhouse. And I remember my mom putting my sister and I in the bathtub and telling us to stay there. And she had ran water, and there was bubbles. And for some reason, bubbles was not something that we had in our family. But here my mom puts bubbles, inside of the bathtub. So you knew something was about to happen, and my dad had pulled into the driveway, and he had come into the house and he was drunk and he was mean. And I remember the vision of me standing up in the bathtub crying and wondering what's going on, because we didn't know, because we were stuck in the bathtub. And my dad had become so mean and violent that he actually tried to pick up the refrigerator and throw it at my mom. So I remember, that was one of the first things that I remember. And I was like 4 or 5 years old. I remember when I was 8 years old, my parents split continually. My dad would get really drunk. He'd go to rehab, and my mom would split and we would move. And then my dad would, not drink for a while. So then my mom would come back and we would all have to go back with my dad. And I remember, I was 8 years old and my father had changed. My father had gone to church and my father had gone to rehab, and he wanted his family back. And we lived in New York and we had to move to Virginia. And I remember my mom was cleaning out our chairs, to pack them up, to put them in the U-Haul. And she was cleaning them because this is a kind of funny story. She was cleaning them because my brothers and sisters and I, whenever she served us liver, and she would leave the room, we would shove all the liver up inside of the chairs, so she was cleaning it all out. And I went to her and I was 8 years old and I said, Mommy, please, I don't want to go back to Daddy. And she just looked at me and I said, please don't make us go. Can I stay with Grandma? Can I live with Grandma? And I remember my mom slapping me across the face and saying, Bambi, you don't understand. And we got into, the U-Haul truck and we, left to go to Virginia. And the first 6 months with my father, he was great. We went to church. He was singing and it was really good. And it only lasted 6 months. And then my father, started the drinking again, and he would line all of us up on the couch, and he would scream at us, telling us, that we weren't his, and that, we didn't belong to him, and he hated us, and he was just drunk. And I really hated my mom, for making us go, because I knew that my dad hadn't changed. And as an 8-year-old little girl, I knew. And when she slapped me across the face and said I didn't understand, and I didn't understand until 20 years later. I didn't understand until 20 years later when I got hit for the first time. I didn't understand until 20 years later when I got spit in my face and said that I was going to amount to nothing and I was only trailer park trash. I didn't understand when I called my brothers and I asked my brothers to come and just beat him up a little bit so he would stop hitting me. I didn't understand until my brothers said, we will do that, but if you don't leave, we won't. So at those moments that I had to experience abuse from the hands of somebody that said that they love me, I didn't understand that question. And I didn't understand my mom's answer in desperation until I had to walk through it myself. We think we know all the answers, when we see other people, in really tough situations and in abusive situations, we want to tell them exactly how they're supposed to do their thing. And somebody asked me just recently, what would you say to a woman that is being abused? And I said, I'm probably not going to say something that you would think that I would say. But as a woman that has been in situations that my husband has choked me until I passed out, and then I wake up and he's laying on the couch as if nothing had happened. I didn't know that I would be the woman that I would make lasagna and he would smash the pan on the ground and it shatter all over the place, and take my spaghetti sauce and dump it inside of a a sink. Everybody told me, Bambi, you're so strong, you're never going to be abused. But I couldn't tell people that I wasn't strong, that I was being abused. And so I tell women today that you have to make those decisions for yourself. I need to walk beside you. I don't need to tell you what to do. Because if I tell you you need to leave and then you leave because I told you, you're going to go back. If I say to my friends, I love you enough to walk beside you no matter what you go through, and that I will love you if you stay and I will love you if you go. But all that I want you to do is start preparing yourself for the time that you're going to be sick and tired of being sick and tired, and you're finally going to make an effort. Start taking the pictures of all your documents. Start going to the grocery store and getting gift cards that he's never going to notice that you got a gift card because you went grocery shopping. Start preparing things until that moment. And domestic violence is not the same for everybody. Some have it really bad, not saying that what happened to me wasn't bad, but it wasn't it it was bad, but I've seen worse. And sometimes that's why I stayed, because I saw worse. And if this woman can put up worse than what I'm putting up with, then what am I complaining about? So there's so many things that go through a woman's head or a man's head of why we stay. And we can't judge the person for staying.
So let me ask you, when you saw that from a childhood and then you saw the impact it had on your family, your brothers, your mother, you as an adult, you shared your experiences. What do you think ultimately was causing that type of environment to happen?
Well, in my household, I know that my dad came, it was a generational thing. My dad's father was an alcoholic. All of his brothers were alcoholics. I just think that there was an identity crisis. But you have to remember, I'm 55 years old. So many things happened, as a young child that we didn't talk about as a society. We didn't talk about the effects of what alcohol, did in our homes. We're now starting to be able to be open and to talk about the things that have happened to us as young kids. And this generation gets to be able to be safe because they're able to talk about the things now when we were never allowed to do that. You never told anybody that you had a dirty old uncle in your household. You never told anybody that you had marks on your back as you went to school because your father was brutally beat you. You didn't talk about those things. And now we live in a society that I do think to a point that we talk too much, that this generation like reveals too much, that sometimes, just because I gave you corn and I didn't give you beans doesn't mean I abused you. You don't know abuse until you've had to experience it in my generation. Um, we didn't have places that we could go, you don't leave your family, you put up with it. I remember one time going to my grandparents' house, and my grandfather was sitting in the corner and he had his beer in the corner. And my grandmother was sitting by the sink and by the stove, and she was stirring her pot. And when I looked at her again, she had a black and blue eye. My grandfather, just prior to us being there, had, it hit her. But she said nothing. She just continued to make the dinner because she knew people were coming over.
I know sometimes we have established this baseline where we think it's okay to correct behavior by using physical force. There's a time where if a child did something that was maybe inappropriate, or if you want to correct a child's behavior, use physical force. Now, if you instill that in a child, they're going to grow up thinking that's right because that is their baseline. That's what they know. I did something wrong to prevent something wrong. I'm expecting to get the belt, the spoon, the hand, the shoe. As I grow up to be an adult now, if I'm trying to correct the behavior of your husband, of your wife, some people may default to that. Even though they remember how much they didn't like it, it's still so ingrained that they're going to say, okay, I'm going to slap him. I'm going to punch her. I'm going to kick. It's interesting how you see so many violent acts happening within the home because you have people who are so intimately involved. And a lot of times, especially for children, when they've experienced this type of abuse, it's from someone who's supposed to protect them, right? Someone who's supposed to
Mhm.
love them, their mother, their father. They grow up, okay, my parents protected me this way. So when I get married, why wouldn't I be likely to exhibit the same behaviors? And you made a good point when you mentioned it passed down. Do you think a lot of times that's what it is? It's that the child sees their parents do it, the parents see their grandparents, and then generation after generation after generation, they're doing the same behavior, not knowing how wrong it actually is.
I do think that that is part of it, but I also, like my sons, there's a book that was written um about their relationships with their moms, and as a mom, our sons look at us as heroes in their lives. Our sons grow up and they want to marry their mommy. Their mommy is everything to them. When you're talking about to a child, to a young teenage boy, and saying, "Hey, if you won $1 million, what would be the first thing that you do?" And most boys and most men would say, "I'm going to buy my mom a house," because that mom is his hero, and especially if the mom was somebody that had to raise him as a single parent. But then there's a disconnect when a son grows up and sometimes there's a disconnect, and the son moves away from his mother because now he realizes that his mother isn't a hero, that his mother is that his mother makes mistakes, that his mother is not somebody that is perfect. So he created an idol, over his mom. So now he's pulling away because now he's mad that his mother isn't perfect. And then until the man grows up and about 25 years old, a man finally has developed, all of his brain, kind of thing. And it's science. It's not me just saying that. But they come to that point and then they realize, wow, my mom did the best she could, but she wasn't perfect. And I think that sometimes in our lives, when we try to do things that our parents didn't do for us, our parents then become idols to us because then we continue to say, "I'm never going to grow up to be like them. I'm never going to grow up to be like them." And there comes a point that we have to put the line in the sand and stop saying we're never going to be like them, but we're going to try different avenues to be different and not judge them for what they've been through, but just accept it, forgive, and to move on. And then we can become different people. I remember my sons, my mom was not very nice. My mom was she was a mean, person. And, there wasn't a lot of affection. So when I grew up, I became a mom that did everything to an extreme. So all birthdays were like extravagant. Every time we went someplace, I overly did things for my children. And I even overly praised them, and not that you shouldn't praise your children, but I was very an intentional parent. And one of my sons for a while I have identical twin boys, and one of them didn't talk to me for a while. And finally, when we started having some conversation and stuff, he said, "Mom, you everything was a performance." So we always felt like it wasn't real because you always was a performance. And I created I did not beat my kids, I didn't abuse them, but I created the same thing but different ways. And so my mom did this, but I did this. So I had to also then repent to my children and then begin to tell them why I did those things. I just never wanted my children to walk into a room and ever feel unworthy. I never wanted them to walk into a room and never felt like they were loved. So I went to the extreme. But I have children that don't speak to me because of that. So what was any different? I was trying to be so different that I created the same thing. And I think that as kids and as parents, the best way to raise great children is to understand that they're not your children. They have been gifted to you. They have been given to you to raise them, to intentionally build them to be men of God and and women of God that create the next generation, and give them more and give them more abilities to be able to be different. and not take it so personally and try so hard to be a parent.
In general, there's so much training and so many classes for everything outside of marriage and raising children. There's a lot of
Yes.
books, there's a lot of how to, there's a lot of parenting for dummies, there's a lot of that. But one of the things that I always found interesting, and I don't have any children myself, but when someone is looking to make someone feel better or to appreciate them or celebrate them, they usually ask, or they usually are observant enough to say, okay, you know what? I know Bambi likes this. So if I'm going to celebrate her, I'm going to get that because I've seen a prior reaction to it. But we don't necessarily do that in our relationships with our spouse, and we don't necessarily do that with our children. Like, how many parents will go to their children when they're old enough to communicate what makes them feel good and say, hey, you did a good job. How would you like to be acknowledged and celebrated?
Mm.
Instead of us saying that this is what I like, I'm going to give this to my child, and my child might be like, after years of this, we thought it was performative. Because I think most people, the last thing that you would ever want to feel like is that the person is doing something for you so others can see it and appreciate it more than you do. Was that kind of the vibe that maybe that they were thinking of?
Yeah, and it's kind of like there is a book out there called the five languages of love by Gary Chapman. And I actually made all of my children take that test so I could see, like as an adult, to see. And I realized that I had a lot of words of affirmation children because I was a words of affirmation. So, but I realized in reading that book, those gifts and those way that you receive love comes differently as you grow. Like I wasn't raised in a household that was a lot of words of affirmation. So I became words of affirmation and so I became words of affirmation out of brokenness because I was broken and I didn't. And then the more that I became healed and transformed, and the more that I was able to look at the inner self of me, my love languages began to change. And the love languages began to change in my children. And my son I have 13 grandchildren, and one of my son has four of them. He has four sons. And, he calls me when he's on his way to work. And the other day we were talking about parenting and stuff. And he said, Mom, I realized in the few, whatever, I don't remember how many months or whatever. But he said, I realized that you were an intentional mom. Everything you did was intentional for us to become something in the future. And he said, and you were diligent at it. And I didn't see that until recently with my own sons, that everything has to be intentional. And he said, and I never realized that about you. And I didn't see that the gift that you really had given to us as kids. I never made a decision until I knew what the decision was going to cost them in the future. When they were boys, I knew that I needed to raise men. They weren't boys. I needed to raise men for the kingdom of God. So everything I did was based on raising them to be able to be an asset to our society. Same thing with my daughters. I had four daughters, and I did the same thing with them. I messed up a little bit on them because I was, I just gotten saved. I just became a Christian. I was a young mom. I was a mother with four daughters at the age of 22 years old. I was young. I made some mistakes. And because I never wanted people to think that our family was on welfare, so my daughters they toed the line. You didn't go outside that box because I didn't want anybody to ever look at me differently because I was a young mom. And then just recently, one of my son, I have identical twin boys. The other one, I was at his house, and, we've struggled with our relationship and stuff. And we began talking, and he said, Mom, for the first time I've realized, he goes, you've been through a whole lot, even before you turned 30 years old. And he said, and you accepted the crumbs that people lay down on the ground for you. And you never understood that you belonged at the table. And he said, so now I understand why you made some of the decisions that you made and some of the men that you got involved in, because they were crumb people. They were just throwing crumbs at you. And your worth was based on their crumbs. When your worth is you get to sit at the table too. And that's what growth does. And that's what saying that I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired of staying in this broken body, and let's do the work. Let's get to the nitty gritty of why I married the men that I married, why I allowed the things that I allowed in my life, what I saw within the mirror of my own reflection, and let's change the narrative. And that's what I've had to do, is change the narrative of who I am versus who I was or who you thought I was.
Yes, and that's a very good point because when it comes to domestic violence or domestic abuse, once we hear those two words, we automatically think that it's physical, but it could be mental, could be spiritual, could be emotional, it could be verbal. We don't necessarily give the same type of attention to the other ones outside of the physical. So when you have someone who's trying to be the very best that they can be, but they're falling short in some areas, they may default or they may result to overcompensating in one way. And that is a form of abuse in itself because you're mistreating someone in a way that you don't necessarily realize. And the five love languages, I always felt that people have a primary one and a secondary one. Like for
Mhm.
me, growing up without my mother and my father, gift giving was like very important to me because I didn't necessarily have that as a child. Same with words of affirmation. The words of affirmation, as I've grown older, have stuck with me just because I think people don't say the words "I love you" enough and mean it. I
Mhm.
think people throw around that word very loosely. Like you can say to acquaintances, "Hey, you know what? I love you. Have a good day." But it doesn't, it loses its value because, like anything, right? Once you start to overuse it, or once there's so much examples of it in the market, it's not as valuable as something that's said once in a while, right? It's like comparing a Honda Civic to a Ferrari. Like a Ferrari is more precious because it's more rare. Honda Civic you see everywhere you go. So I always worry that just because we like something, we automatically assume someone else likes it. And then we push and we push and we push. And as you used a good word when you said intention, I think the intentions of people always have to be genuine and pure. And people can pick up on that. Like if you're pure in your intentions, people be like, you know what, Bambi really meant this. Even though it may not be something I really appreciate, I know her heart was in the right place, in the right place. But when it's something that's like passive, like, here, Bambi, I got you the shirt, and the person is literally throwing it at you, it's not even wrapped, it's like an afterthought, then you're going to feel like an afterthought.
Yes,
So you
absolutely.
mentioned, right? You mentioned there's like some, you don't necessarily have the best relationship with your children. What do you think can be told to maybe some parents out there that are in a similar situation to you that feel like they've mistreated or feel like there's different types of violence or abuse in their home, but they're trying to make sure that they can at least correct it and minimize some of the damage that's happened?
I I have 6 children, and I have 2 children that do not speak to me, and I haven't spoken, to them in a couple years. And so then I have the other 4 that I have relationships with. And I, as a mom, we did the best that we could with what the information that we had. The best place, for you to be, and because I am a Christian, is on your knees before God, and realize that when you see the pictures of a family all together, on Facebook, you see this really cute little picture and everybody's smiling, everybody's happy, and oh my goodness, they had their whole family together. I want you to realize that 10 minutes prior to that, that mother was screaming at her children. That mother was saying, "You ruined my picture. You better be smiling. Don't you put those shoes on. You know that I picked out this. Why did you eat that chocolate? You knew we were getting pictures." So that picture that you're seeing didn't come with some adversaries, didn't come with every child going, "Okay, mommy, we love pictures." It didn't come that way, but that was the end result. And I just want people to stop comparing ourselves. We all have been through the muck of life. We all have been through things that we are not proud of. But we can take those situations and we can humble ourselves and realize that we just did the best we could. And when I have 6 children, and we always say, you know, I heard something just recently that says, we always say, oh, I treated them all the same. I didn't, because you know what?